2020. I am joined today by Carlos Ponce, just outside of Mexico City.
Hi, Tulio.
Yes, hi, I'm Tulio Sergusa from Los Angeles, and we're joined by Chris Doig of Wayferry. Today we're going to be talking about the challenges in choosing software and avoiding buyer's remorse. But before we go into all that, let's get to know you, Chris, a little bit. Please introduce yourself to the audience. Tell us a bit about yourself. I know you have a book out. Please let the audience get to know you a little bit.
Okay, Tulio, a little bit of background. I'm originally from South Africa, where I trained as an electrical engineer. And in about 95, we immigrated over to the States. And rather than start my own company, I ended up working for some large corporates like Seagate, Boeing, etc., and also a few startups, and kept on seeing the same problem of people buying software and it not meeting their expectations. It boils down to they would read the reviews and talk to their colleagues and then pay and pray. And it didn't matter how big or small the company was, the problem was the same always. And then a few years later, I was working for a life science company and got laid off when they got bad news from the FDA. And I was working on a project to select project management software. And I thought to myself, surely I can reuse all this work I've done. And that was the genesis of the company Wayferry. So one interesting thing I bring is a sort of at least a multicultural approach to this sort of thing, having lived in two different cultures.
Now, very different. I think you have a book out as well. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, there's a whole lot of work that goes into the process of selecting software that most people don't really pay attention to. It's too much detail. And I wrote this book. It's called Rethinking Enterprise Software Selection. Stop Buying Square Pegs for Round Holes. I published it on Amazon. But if any of your listeners want a copy, they can just reach out to me on LinkedIn and I'll send them a PDF copy. But essentially what it does, it's written in business language. It's not technical at all, even includes a few cartoons in there. But it explains why this problem exists and how to solve it. Kind of like, giving some perspective around it.
Excellent. Well, cartoons, you're definitely speaking Carlos's language. Let's talk
Yes.
He's an amazing illustrator. Let's talk about Wayferry. So what's the purpose of the company? What is it that you guys do?
Well, as I said, I got laid off a few years ago. And we started creating a company that was a sort of a software as a service company to make software that people could use to evaluate enterprise software, basically ERP and things like that. And after a while, we found out that people aren't really interested in doing the work. So we pivoted the company and turned it into a consulting company that used our software. And a few years ago, we completely rewrote our software from scratch, ended up using a low-code tool called Mendex. It turned out to be a very good decision because it takes care of all the housekeeping like security. But in the background, it is what we try and do. We've got two sort of aspects. One is thought leadership. Now, you can never really claim to be a thought leader yourself. That's for other people to say. But what I did was write the book that explained the problem. And then our tool is how we have sort of turned it into a process to solve the problem. In other words, we have a set, defined series of steps to take the company through to help them find what software they need. And the biggest problem in all of this is people don't know what they need.
All right. Well, it sounds like something we should definitely dig in a little bit more. I'm excited to learn a lot more. And let's go right into it. Carlos, what's our topic for today? Let's kick it off.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Tulio, and thanks to our guest. Today we're going to be speaking about buyer's remorse, or why ERP software purchases don't meet expectations and how to avoid the problem. Or in other words, the reasons why an enterprise software purchase should be considered an investment, not an expense. So the first question that I would like to ask our guest is, Why did you choose this particular topic, Chris, and why did you decide that it was relevant for today's conversation on DojoLIVE?
It's very, very common. I've seen a number of CFOs who they tend to focus on cutting costs, most CFOs, but they don't even think in terms of ROI when it comes to spending millions of dollars on software. But going a little bit further back, why this happens is people don't know what they want. That is the root cause of the problem. And if I can quote Lewis Carroll from Alice in Wonderland, who said, if you don't know what ERP you want, then any ERP will do. Well, that's a bit of a paraphrase, but it gets the idea. People don't know what they want, and it's so much work to find out what they want that they shortcut the process. And then at the end of the day, they get the software and they discover it isn't doing what they expected, and it's all downhill from there. It's all buyer's remorse. And I can give a little story if you like. Many years ago, I was living in Maryland and I wanted to buy a new car. And I'd moved across from California. And they've got a lot more extreme weather there. And I really wanted a thermometer in the car. And ended up choosing one that had a thermometer in it. But, you know, if I'd thought I was getting a car with a thermometer and it wasn't there, I would have been very unhappy. But if I'd known that it didn't have a thermometer and chosen that car, I would have said, well, you know, I know what I'm getting into. It doesn't have everything I want, but I'm happy with it. So the key is to know what you want before you sign on the dotted line, so to speak.
So, I mean, that's a challenge. I hope I'm coming in through because I realized my mic wasn't on properly. So that's a challenge for companies, right? You mentioned something about not knowing what they want, right? I can think back almost 3 decades ago when platforms like SAP and Oracle were really just starting to get steam in the marketplace. And a lot of companies adopted their software, but the outcomes were disastrous because they were basically adopting the software without any customization, without any thought to how it would apply to the business. So essentially, it was a hard lesson by a lot of enterprises that you can't let a software company dictate how you run your business, but you could use software to help you support how you run the business. So fast forward, it's now 3 decades later. Why are companies still struggling with this, you think, in terms of identifying what they need and why they need it? And how can they get better at it, better at making better choices?
Well, companies defining what they need, that's where they all go wrong. They don't define what they need. And there are 2 sides to this problem. The one is, as you said, you know, using your existing processes. And the other is customizing the sort of software extensively. Both of those are not ways you want to go. What I say to folks is, if you look at software, for example, and let me phrase this with a story, is several years ago, I worked at Netflix for a while. That was really fun, especially for an electrical engineer working in Silicon Valley. But anyway, not that I do electrical engineering anymore. But what Netflix taught me is that they wrote the software that is what you see when you log into Netflix. That is what differentiated them in the market. But in the background, stuff like HR software and that sort of thing, they just bought that off the shelf because there was no business value by being special. So when you look at something like ERP software, you actually want to avoid customization, which you can't do on the web anyway. But if you happen to buy software that you run in a data center, you want to avoid customizing it because it makes it much more expensive, if not impossible, to upgrade. And you need to go through the business processes. And here's the absolute key on all of that. It is understanding the difference between business requirements and software requirements. Business requirements define what the software must deliver. And the key word there is what. Software requirements define how the software will be configured or written if necessary. But that is how. Business requirements focus on what the software must deliver in terms of that's what you consider when you select the software. Software requirements are how you're going to configure it, and that is part of the implementation. Most people muddle those two up. So you need to go through all the business processes, define or discover what is being delivered at the end of every process. You actually need the inputs as well, because you want to link them all together. Because if you find any inputs, outputs that go nowhere, you know you've got a problem that needs resolving. But once you've defined what the software must deliver, how it delivers that is completely irrelevant. So if you take a purchase order, for example, part of configuring a purchase order is the approvals. Now, how those approvals actually work makes no difference whatsoever to selecting the software, as long as the approvals workflow gives you what you want. But at the end of the day, what has got to come out of that process is an approved purchase order that sends off to a supplier to get the goods. So the key thing is defining what you need, and that's where people they get lost there. They just get stuck in the weeds. And one of the things that sometimes go through their existing processes and they document everything, and it's a total rabbit hole. I mean, it's not to say it's totally wasted, but that ends up delaying the process. You can use that information in determining what you need, but it's an expensive way to get it.
Well, okay, so what I'm hearing is plan out what your requirements are that tie into your specific business goals and outcomes that you want to accomplish, and then set out on a journey to identify what could meet those requirements. But does that also include that making a choice between enterprise software versus an SaaS type solution, or build your own? And how does your company help figure those things out?
Okay, we help folks select the software and then manage the implementation for success. When it comes to building your own, as I said a moment ago with the Netflix example, avoid that like the plague unless there is a valid business reason for doing it. Does building your own give you something that nobody else has in the marketplace? Then it's worth it. But if you could, buy it off the shelf, like HR software, for example, then the last thing you want to do is build that, because not only will you'll be amortizing the cost of that build over one company instead of hundreds or thousands, so it's very expensive. And then you've also got things like security, and security is a huge issue these days. And that's one reason why I tend to suggest folks look at software in the cloud as opposed to the data center. There was a company, it's going to remain nameless, I'm not even going to say where it was, but it was in California, that had a revenue of about 250 million, 400 users or so. They hadn't patched their service since 2012. They got hit by ransomware. It took them offline for 2 weeks, and it cost them $500,000 to get the keys to get the software back again. That was a very, very expensive mistake. If they'd been using ERP software in the cloud, that would not have happened. And that's a huge reason for going to the cloud. The other reason for going to the cloud is there is very little value added by IT looking after the servers, doing the backups, doing the hot failovers, disaster recovery, and all of that. That can easily be outsourced to a cloud vendor. You need to focus, or a company needs to focus on where they can add value, which is configuring and fine-tuning the implementation to deliver value to match what your processes need. So that's tends to be why I suggest folks go for the cloud, but that doesn't mean they have to. I mean, there are certain cases, particularly around the FDA, where you might want to keep the software in a data center or something like that, but you have to realize you're going to be paying for that privilege these days.
Right. So how does Wayferry help me as an enterprise company to make these decisions? What do you guys do? You do some kind of an assessment? How much is what's the process? How do I engage Wayferry to figure all these things out?
Okay, there are 6 steps in the process, and with any building, you start with site work and the foundation, and that's where we start. We start with one we call business alignment, and we use a model that is the vision, the goals, and the strategy. The vision exists to guide the setting of the goals, and you should never be able to achieve your vision. If I can give a simple example, in the early 90s, Microsoft's vision was a PC on every desktop, a PC in every home. About 97, they achieved that. And they almost lost their way in the marketplace. Apple, on the other hand, Steve Jobs had a vision, just to paraphrase him, that to make technology useful to the everyday person. They produced the iPod, the iPhone, the iPad, and the most valuable company in the world. That's the power of the right vision. Then the goals themselves, which are guided by the vision, achieving those goals is how a company creates value. And so you need to define what your business goals are. For example, grow sales by 10% this year, etc., that kind of thing. Then the strategy is how you're going to achieve those goals. So part of the strategy could be implementing a new ERP system if you've outgrown your existing one. And that's how you link the ERP system right back to the business goals, because everything the ERP does must be squarely aimed at helping the company meet those goals. And if you can do that, then you're home and dry, because the company will be doing what it's supposed to be doing. Then once we've done the business alignment, the next step it's a sort of a sub-step, is to talk to the process owners, find out what those processes are and what they must deliver. When you've done all of that, we move into the requirements phase, and we've got an extensive library of several thousand requirements, and we link that to what the software must deliver. And we go down to, some people would say, an excruciating level of detail. But the problem here is the devil is in the details. And that devil is all those assumptions people make about software that turn out not to be true. I had somebody say the other day, what do you mean my financial reports don't have footnotes? I've never heard of an ERP system that doesn't have footnotes on financial reports. And he was a little bit ticked off by that. But that's a kind of problem you want to avoid. And then after you do requirements, you do an evaluation, you measure how well the products meet those requirements. Then you do a selection, typically the top 3 products when you've measured. You do the purchase negotiation, and then you finally go into implementation, success management, and finish off with user acceptance testing. That's a very high level step through of the process.
Yeah. And let's talk about the process for that, right? So for a mid-sized company versus a large organization, what's the typical time frame that any company that's thinking about doing this should plan? And second, and the other question I have relates to adoption. Have you seen different adoption based on different markets? How does various culture come into the picture in terms of planning? i.e. US versus Europe or versus Asia, etc. Those kinds of consideration, how do they come up and how are they handled? So first, let me rephrase. What's the typical time frame for a mid-sized company to a large-sized company to do all those things you just mentioned earlier?
Mid-sized companies, you got to look at what are the causes of delays, and one of the big causes of delays is not being able to get meetings with people. Because if the company doesn't tell you what they want, you can't help them buy it. So things like that are outside our control. If everything runs very smoothly, you could look at 4 months or so to define your requirements. The whole process to select the software could range from 6 to 10 months. It's very loose. It depends on a lot of things. Sometimes if the market is very busy, it can take a month to schedule demos of the software. Other times the vendors are beating your door down to schedule the demos. Those sort of things. But 6 months to 10 months is fairly typical. You go into larger companies and you're looking at a year, maybe slightly longer.
It sounds though that the planning becomes really critical in that process. And I know that things move a lot faster today than they were just even a decade ago. So 6 months to longer seems like a very long time. You know, a lot can change in terms of technology and even in the markets. And so how do you help organizations mitigate those risks from changes? Is there some contingency planning as part of that that's built into the strategy?
Yes, very, very much so. And let me tell you another story. We were helping a client in the early days. They were a contract pharmaceutical manufacturing company. And we were sitting around the table waiting requirements for importance. And this guy's name was Buddy, and he was responsible for this company's store. Now, bear in mind, these are contract drugs for large drug companies, FDA is involved, everything. Anyway, we were going through the requirements, and for some of the requirements, I wrote down the guy's name, why he wanted them, and all of that. And when I did that, now this guy, Buddy, was a literal blue-collar worker. He used to come to work every day in blue-collar overalls. And when he saw what he needed being written down, his eyes absolutely lit up. And I suddenly realized this is the key to getting user buy-in. Get them involved with making the decision. Because with us, it's not us making the decision. We don't sell software, we don't implement it, we don't support it. We just help the clients select it and then manage the implementation. But when the users realize it's their needs that are driving the requirements, that builds the buy-in. That's incredibly important. So, you know, there are 4 places you touch users. The first is a kickoff meeting. The second is the interviews of the process owners. The third is you interview process owners and users as to how important the requirements are. We call that waiting requirements. And the fourth is the demos. By the time people have been through all of that, they are usually pretty ready to move to the new system. The other thing is you've got to use diplomacy, because very often the new system will result in some structural changes. But most of the time we find that folks redeploy people internally rather than getting rid of them, because you know, they know all the systems and that kind of thing.
Sounds like good sound advice. You know, get the users involved early and often, and let them help you shape it if you want to get adoption. Otherwise, it just feels like you're forcing a change that no one's ready for. So definitely good advice there. So we're coming up on time soon. I want to shift a little bit into what it's been like for you providing this service and this offering to various clients. And do you have any stories about, is it easier in certain markets than others? Are there certain countries or markets that are more open to that kind of collaboration versus those who kind of like more top down? What's been your experience like in dealing with the various characters I'm sure you've had to deal with over the years in helping them come up with a proper solution?
Well, let me mention one thing. I'm originally from South Africa, as I mentioned, and I've also heard this problem pops up in India, and it's a cultural problem. Certainly in South Africa, a lot of folks, particularly the indigenous folks, even when they get involved in business, the culture there is to say yes. So the culture is always to agree. And I have no idea if that was driven by the original British occupation of Southern Africa. But anyway, you know, and it's always to please the person asking you the question. And of course, that means you don't notice the problems. And I've heard Indian folks do this as well. Whereas when you come to the US, and coming from outside of the US, I've certainly seen it, I've been much more aware of it, is you get mercilessly grilled, and this tends to expose the problems. And to me, one of the strengths of the society in the US is the ability of folks at every level to ask questions, and this tends to make people think, and then they say, whoa, we're so glad you mentioned that, we never thought about that. And you know, when that happens, you've often made a big save, and that's what you try and do. When it comes to top-down approach, you know, growing up in South Africa, it was a British dominated society in a way, culturally. Certainly I was English speaking. That tended to be what you could call a military top-down and even a boarding school approach. You listen to those above you, otherwise you got canned. You come to the US and it's you know, somebody on the shop floor doesn't feel anything about speaking to the CEO in a mid-sized company, and that can say, you know, those can lead to big savings and big improvements, because the guys doing the work, they experience the frustrations firsthand, whereas the management further back don't. And to me, that's a strength I see in the US.
Well, that's some great observation. It sounds as though in order to drive innovation, you have to encourage people to speak up and to speak their minds and offer valuable input, even if it's difficult sometimes to hear and it strokes the ego the wrong way. It's so critically important to get users involved and hear people's opinion and get their truth, because ultimately that's going to increase the adoption. Tell us a little bit about your journey as an entrepreneur building this business. What has that been like for you? Any lessons you've personally learned through this experience?
Yes, you always underestimated radically. Whatever you do takes much longer and it's much harder, but the rewards are much greater at the end of the day. You know, what I find so satisfying is when a company implements ERP and it just meets or sometimes even exceeds expectations. That's what gives me the most satisfaction.
Great. Lovely to hear the commitment you have and the passion you have for helping customers succeed. It's been a pleasure to have you with us, Chris. Thank you for joining us today. And Carlos, what do we got coming up for the rest of the week? I know we have tomorrow and Thursday, we have 2 more guests. Please let us know what we got coming up. You're on mute.
Yeah, well, you're the one who told me to put myself on mute, so I did. I did. Okay, now, well, first of all, thank you. Thanks to our guest, Chris, for having been with us today. And this week we still have 2 more shows. One is tomorrow. We're going to be speaking with Noah Laphart, the CTO at Variable, which is an on-demand marketplace for manufacturing, logistics, and warehousing labor, on the topic of manufacturing and flexible capacity through on-demand labor. So that's the topic. And then on Thursday, we'll be speaking with Shruti Rao, the co-founder, and CBO at Vendia. And unfortunately, I don't have the topic, Tulio. It's one of those cases where we're approaching the day for the interview. We don't have the topic yet, but it should be as interesting as ever, and it's pretty much as every Dojo Live conversation that we have right here. And both of them are going to be right here at 1 p.m. Pacific. So stick around on Dojo Live, and thanks again. See you next time.
Thanks, everyone. Stay safe.
Stay
Just
safe.
stay with us, Chris, as we wrap up.